The dust of Caldera Gulch tasted of grit and regret. It was a fine, pale powder that clung to everything: the sweat on a man's neck, the cracked leather of his saddle, the bottom of his whiskey glass. It rose in ghostly plumes under the hooves of Eli Thatcher's horse, a mare as weary as he was, and settled on the brim of his hat. The sun was a merciless hammer in a white-hot sky, beating down on the long, single street of the town until the air shimmered and the warped planks of the buildings seemed to sag under the assault. Caldera Gulch was not a town for honest men. It was a place where things ended, or, worse, were forgotten. Tucked hard against the Mexican frontier, it was a festering sore of a settlement, drawing in gun runners, rustlers, and men whose names were only whispered in warrants far to the east. The law, such as it was, lived in the bottom of a bottle in the sheriff's office, and justice was a matter of who drew fastest. Eli had not come here for justice. He had learned long ago that justice was a phantom, a story told to children. He had come looking for a man, a shadow who went by the name of Silas Marston, rumored to be the spider at the center of a web that stretched across 3 territories. A web spun to catch girls and sell them to the highest bidder. It was a ghost Eli had been chasing for 10 years, a ghost that wore his sister's face. He swung down from his horse in front of the livery, the muscles in his back and legs screaming from days in the saddle. He was a tall man, built lean and hard like the country that had shaped him. His face was weathered, browned by the sun and lined by wind, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that saw too much and said too little. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion, the way a man does when he has learned that life is a currency best spent with care. He handed the reins to a stable hand, a boy no older than 15 with eyes that had already seen enough to look old. "Just water and feed," Eli said, his voice a low rasp, dry as the dust he'd been breathing. "I won't be long." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked toward the center of town, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. His rifle, a Winchester he kept cleaner than his own soul, was cradled in his other arm. In a place like Caldera Gulch, a man's life was measured by the distance between his hand and his gun. The town was a cacophony of noise and desperation. The tinny, frantic notes of a piano spilled from the swinging doors of the Golden Spur Saloon, a sound too cheerful for the grim-faced men slouching in the slivers of shade. Shouts in Spanish and slurred English tangled in the air. From a side alley, Eli heard a different sound, the wet smack of a fist against flesh, followed by a choked cry. He stopped. The creed he lived by was a simple one, etched into him by a loss so profound it had hollowed out a permanent space in his chest. You did not raise a hand unless it was to protect. You did not stand by while the strong preyed on the weak. It was a creed that had earned him more trouble than friends, but it was all he had left. He turned into the alley. 3 men, grimy ranch hands by the look of their worn clothes and arrogant posture, had a boy pinned against a wall. The boy was small, Mexican, with big, terrified eyes and a trickle of blood running from his lip. One of the men held him while the other 2 took turns hitting him, their grunts of effort punctuated by the boy's whimpers. A half-eaten loaf of bread lay in the dirt nearby. Eli did not shout. He did not rush. He simply walked forward until his shadow fell over them. The man with his fist raised paused, turning his head. His face was flushed with cheap liquor and easy cruelty. "This ain't your concern, stranger," he snarled. Eli's gaze did not waver from the man's face. "Let the boy go." The man laughed, a short, ugly sound. "He's a thief. Stole this bread right from our wagon." He gestured to his friends. "We're just teaching him a lesson on property." "He's a hungry boy," Eli said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "You're 3 grown men. The lesson is over." The second man stepped forward, puffing out his chest. He was bigger than the first, with a broken nose and small, mean eyes. "And who are you to say so?" Eli shifted his weight slightly. He did not move his rifle, but the simple motion was enough. It was a promise. "I'm the man telling you to walk away." For a long moment, the air in the alley was thick with unspoken violence. The men sized him up. The steady eyes, the hand near the gun, the set of his jaw that spoke of a man who did not make idle threats. They saw a wolf, not a sheep, and their drunken courage began to curdle. The first man shoved the boy to the ground and backed away. "He ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. The three of them shuffled out of the alley, casting resentful glances over their shoulders. Eli watched them go before turning his attention to the boy, who was scrambling to his feet, still shaking. Eli bent down, picked up the loaf of bread, and brushed the dirt from it. He held it out. The boy stared at the bread, then at Eli's face, his expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. He snatched the loaf and, without a word, bolted down the alley and disappeared. Eli watched him go, a familiar ache settling in his chest. He had saved one boy from one beating. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a cup. He stepped out of the alley and continued toward the Golden Spur. It was the biggest, loudest building in town, which meant it was the most likely place to find a man like Marston, or at least to hear his name. He pushed through the swinging doors and was immediately hit by a wall of heat, noise, and the stale smell of sweat, spilled whiskey, and cheap perfume. The saloon was crowded, a sea of stained hats and stubbled faces. Men packed the long bar, their voices loud and their laughter louder. Painted women with tired eyes moved through the tables, offering smiles that did not reach their eyes. Eli scanned the room, his gaze lingering on faces, searching for a sign, a whisper, anything that might lead him to Marston. He saw nothing but cheap whiskey and cheaper lives. He was about to turn and leave when he noticed a strange current in the room. A group of men near the back were not drinking or gambling. They were gathered around a rear door that stood slightly ajar, their attention fixed on something happening just outside. Their expressions were greedy, their comments low and guttural. Eli's stomach tightened. He knew that look. It was the look of vultures circling a kill. He moved toward the back of the room, his steps silent and deliberate. He stood behind the group of men, peering over their shoulders through the open doorway. What he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. In the dusty, sun-bleached yard behind the saloon, an auction was taking place, but it was not cattle or horses on the block. It was women. 2 women stood huddled together, their face streaked with tears, while a third stood on a wooden crate in the center of a semicircle of drunken bidders. An auctioneer, a fat, sweating man with a booming voice and a stained waistcoat, was extolling her virtues as if she were a prize mare. The scene was so grotesquely familiar that for a moment, Eli could not breathe. The world seemed to tilt, the noise of the saloon fading to a dull roar in his ears. He was 10 years younger, standing helpless on the porch of his family's small ranch, watching a group of men ride away with his sister, Ruth. She had been 15, all fire and laughter, with a spirit as bright as a summer morning. They had taken her, and the sheriff had done nothing. The world had done nothing. His hand tightened on his rifle, the wood smooth and cold against his skin. He felt the old rage, the black, helpless fury that had been his constant companion for a decade, rise up in him. He wanted to raise the rifle, to clear the yard of these animals, to burn this whole rotten town to the ground. Then he saw her, the woman on the crate. She was not like the others, where they showed only terror. She held herself with a strange, brittle stillness. She was half-dressed in a thin chemise that did little to hide the bruises on her arms and shoulders. Her dark hair was unbound, falling in a tangled wave down her back. Her face was pale, her features fine and delicate. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and dark, and in their depths, he saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else, a hard, defiant ember glowing in the ashes of her despair. The auctioneer was growing impatient. The bids were sluggish, the men too drunk or too cheap to meet his price. "Come now, gentlemen, a beauty like this, fresh and unbroken, $100. Who'll give me 100? The men in the crowd just laughed and made lewd jokes. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer's face purpled with frustration. He grabbed the woman's arm, his thick fingers digging into her flesh, and began to drag her off the crate. "Fine," he bellowed. "If none of you vultures appreciate quality, she goes back to the house. There are other ways to make a profit." He pulled her, and she stumbled, a small cry escaping her lips. It was then that her eyes, sweeping desperately over the crowd of leering faces, found Eli's. Their gazes locked across the dusty yard. In that instant, the world fell away. There was only the silent communication between two strangers bound by a moment of shared desperation. He saw her terror, her shame, her fierce, buried pride. And she, in his stormy gray eyes, must have seen something. Not pity, not lust, but something else. A flicker of recognition, a kindred pain. Her lips parted. It was not a sound meant for the crowd, but a breath, a whisper that traveled across the space between them as if carried on a current of sheer will. "Buy me," she whispered. The words were barely audible, lost in the jeers of the crowd. But Eli heard them as clearly as if she had shouted them in his ear. "I'm yours." It was not a plea for a master. It was a plea for an end to this. He could see it in her eyes. She was choosing the devil she did not know over the one she did. It was the last, most desperate gamble of a soul with nothing left to lose. And it broke him. The memory of Ruth crashed over him with the force of a physical blow. Her face, her laughter, the way she had looked back at him as they dragged her away, a look of terror and a silent plea for a help he could not give. He had been a boy then, powerless. He was not a boy now. He did not know the woman's name. He did not know her story, but he knew that look in her eyes. He had failed his sister. He would not fail this stranger. The rifle slipped from his grasp. It fell to the ground with a soft thud, landing in the fine, pale dust. The sound was small, insignificant, but in the sudden silence that fell over the yard, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head turned toward him. Eli stepped forward, out of the shadows of the doorway and into the harsh glare of the sun. He walked past the stunned bidders, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. He stopped in front of the auctioneer, who stared at him, his mouth agape. Eli reached into the leather pouch on his belt. He pulled out a small, heavy sack and tossed it to the auctioneer. It landed in the man's fleshy palm with a satisfying clink of gold coin. It was everything he had in the world, the sum of months of hard work, of guiding cattle through treacherous country, of sleeping on hard ground under cold stars. "That should cover it," Eli said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. The auctioneer's eyes widened as he peered into the sack. Greed washed over his face. Erasing his surprise, he nodded, a slow, oily smile spreading across his lips. "Sold!" he boomed. "To the quiet gentleman in the back." He released the woman's arm, shoving her forward toward Eli. She stumbled again, her legs weak, and would have fallen if Eli had not caught her. He put one arm around her waist, steadying her. She was light, fragile, as if a strong wind might carry her away. He could feel her trembling, a fine, violent shudder that ran through her whole body. He looked down at her. Her face was buried against his chest, her hair smelling of dust and fear. He did not say a word. He simply scooped her up into his arms, as gently as if she were made of glass. She weighed next to nothing. He turned and carried her back toward the saloon. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and a grudging respect. No one spoke. No one dared to meet his eyes. He walked through the saloon, past the silent drinkers and the wide-eyed women, and out into the blinding sunlight of the street. He carried her to the livery stables, the dust muffling their footsteps. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and horses. He set her down gently on a bale of hay in a quiet corner. For the first time, she looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face, full of 1,000 unspoken questions. She was still trembling, her body braced for a blow, for a demand, for the violence that she had been taught to expect from men. Eli knelt in front of her, so their eyes were level. He saw the terror there, but he also saw the exhaustion. The deep, bone-weary exhaustion of a soul that had been fighting for too long. "You're safe now," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He reached out, not to touch her, but to show her his empty hands. "My name is Eli. No one is going to hurt you again." She just stared at him, her throat working, but no sound came out. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of this quiet man who had dropped his rifle, spent a small fortune on a woman he did not know, and then treated her with a gentleness she had forgotten could exist. "I'm taking you away from here," he continued. "Somewhere you can be free. If you want to leave, at any time, I won't stop you. You don't owe me anything." He saw the flicker of disbelief in her eyes, the war between hope and a lifetime of harsh experience. He did not press her. He simply stood, bought a second horse, a gentle-looking bay, from the stable hand with the last of his silver dollars, and prepared them for the road. They rode out of Caldera Gulch as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. She rode beside him, her back straight, her face a pale, unreadable mask. They did not speak. There were no words for what had passed between them. As darkness fell, the desert air grew cold. The sky, vast and black, was filled with a spray of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. A storm was building on the horizon, distant flashes of lightning illuminating the clouds in ghostly bursts. Eli found a small, abandoned adobe cabin nestled in a cluster of rocks, a relic from some long-forgotten prospector. It was not much, but it was shelter. Inside, he built a small fire in the hearth. The flames pushed back the darkness and the chill, casting dancing shadows on the crumbling walls. He offered her the last of his jerky and the water from his canteen. She ate and drank slowly, her eyes never leaving him, watching his every move with the wary intensity of a cornered animal. When she was done, he laid out his bedroll for her near the fire. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice low. He took his rifle and sat with his back against the wall by the door, a silent guardian in the night. Outside, the storm broke. The wind howled around the small cabin, and rain began to lash against the roof. The world outside was a tumult of wind and water, but inside, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of two people breathing in the dark. Eli watched her. He expected her to sleep, to succumb to the exhaustion that was plain on her face, but she did not. She lay on the bedroll, curled on her side, her body tense, and through the long hours of the stormy night, her eyes remained open, fixed on the flickering flames, a silent, watchful sentinel in the heart of the storm. She did not run, but she did not sleep either. The storm passed with the night, leaving the desert air scrubbed clean and smelling of rain and wet creosote. When the first pale light of dawn crept into the adobe cabin, it found Eli already awake, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the woman sleeping fitfully by the dying embers of the fire. Sometime before morning, exhaustion had finally claimed her, but her rest was not peaceful. Her brow was furrowed, and she whimpered softly, her hands clenched into fists as if fighting off specters in her dreams. For days, they rode north, away from the festering wound of Caldera Gulch and into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Arizona Territory. A fragile silence existed between them, a space filled with unspoken questions and unshared histories. Eli did not ask her name, and she did not offer it. He called her ma'am on the rare occasions he spoke, and she answered with a slight nod, her eyes always averted. He saw the way she watched him, her gaze as wary and skittish as a wild mustang's. She expected the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to curdle into a demand. She ate the food he provided, rode the horse he had bought, and wrapped herself in the blanket he gave her at night. But she kept her soul locked away, a fortress he made no attempt to breach. He understood. Trust was a currency she did not have, and he would not demand it. Instead, he gave her dignity. He rode a few paces ahead, giving her the illusion of leading. When they made camp, he would busy himself with the horses or scouting the area, allowing her privacy. He never watched her change or wash, turning his back and creating a barrier of respect that was more solid than any wall. He was patient. He had learned patience from the land itself, from watching the slow, inexorable turning of the seasons, from tracking men across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. He could wait for her to feel safe. He had nowhere else to be. Their destination was a memory, a hope he clung to. The Circle C Ranch, nestled in a valley north of the Gila River. He had worked there years ago for a man named Abernathy, a tough but fair old rancher with a kind wife and a sprawling herd of cattle. It was a decent place, a place where a woman could find honest work cooking or cleaning, a place where she could be safe and begin to piece her life back together. It was the only sanctuary he could think of in a world that offered so few. They traveled through a landscape of raw, brutal beauty. They navigated winding canyons where the rock walls rose 1,000 feet on either side, their layers telling the story of a world millions of years old. They crossed sun-scorched plains where the heat shimmered off the baked earth, and the only signs of life were the lizards that darted between rocks and the hawks that circled high overhead in the endless blue sky. The wind was a constant companion, a restless spirit that sighed through the sagebrush and howled over the mesas, whipping sand into their faces and tearing at their clothes. On the 4th day, Eli sensed they were being followed. It was not something he saw, but something he felt, a prickling on the back of his neck, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the wilderness. He began to watch their back trail more closely, his hand never far from his Colt. Late in the afternoon, as they rode through a narrow pass choked with boulders, he saw them, 2 riders, keeping their distance but moving with a grim purpose. He did not alarm the woman. He simply urged his horse forward, looking for a place to make a stand. He found it a mile later, a place where the trail widened into a small, defensible clearing surrounded by a jumble of rocks. He dismounted and turned to her. "Get down," he said, his voice low and calm, betraying none of the tension coiled in his gut. "Stay behind that rock and do not move, no matter what you hear." Fear flared in her eyes, but she did as he commanded without question, scrambling behind a large granite boulder. Eli took his Winchester from its scabbard and rested it on another rock, its long barrel pointed back down the trail. Then he waited. The 2 riders appeared a few minutes later, walking their horses slowly into the clearing. They were the kind of men bred by places like Caldera Gulch, slovenly, confident in their own cruelty. One was a hulking brute of a man with a tangle of greasy black hair and a sneer permanently etched on his face. The other was smaller, weaselly, with shifty eyes that darted everywhere at once. They reined in their horses when they saw Eli standing alone. "Well, look what we have here," the big one said, his voice a gravelly boom. "Lost your traveling companion, friend." Eli did not answer. He just watched them, his face impassive, the rifle held steady in his hands. "Mr. Finch, back in the gulch. He ain't happy," the weaselly one chirped. "That was his property you walked off with. He wants it back." "She's not property," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. The big man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the rocks. "That ain't for you to decide. We can do this easy or we can do this hard. Just give us the girl, and we'll be on our way. Might even let you keep your horse." "You need to turn around and ride back the way you came." Eli said it was not a suggestion. It was a final warning. The big man's sneer widened. He exchanged a look with his partner, and his hand moved toward the pistol on his hip. "I reckon we'll do it the hard way." He never cleared the leather. Eli's Winchester cracked, the sound sharp and definitive in the stillness of the afternoon. The big man's hat flew from his head. A neat hole punched through the crown. His hand froze, his eyes wide with shock. The second man, who had been reaching for his own gun, yelped and threw his hands in the air. Eli worked the lever on the rifle, the slick metallic sound of a fresh round being chambered filling the silence. "The next one won't be so high," he said, his voice as cold and hard as the rock he leaned against. The big man stared at him, his bravado draining away, replaced by a dawning understanding. He was not dealing with some soft-hearted farmer. He was dealing with a man who knew his way around a gun, a man who did not hesitate. The fear in his eyes was mingled with a grudging respect. "Now get off your horse," Eli commanded. The man hesitated for a second, then swung his leg over the saddle and slid to the ground. "Yours too," Eli said to the smaller man, who practically fell from his horse in his haste to obey. "Take off your gun belts, slowly, and let them fall." They did as they were told, their holsters thudding into the dust. "Now you're going to walk back to Caldera Gulch," Eli said, his gaze unwavering. "You're going to tell Mr. Finch that if he ever sends anyone after us again, I will come back for him. Do you understand me?" The big man nodded, his throat tight. "I said," Eli repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "Do you understand me?" "Yes," the man croaked. "We understand." "Good. Now start walking." They turned and began to trudge back down the trail, two disarmed and humiliated men with a long, hot walk ahead of them. Eli watched them until they were out of sight. Only then did he lower the rifle, the rigid lines of his body softening slightly. He turned to the rock where the woman was hiding. "You can come out now," he said. She emerged slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide. She looked at him, then at the two gun belts lying in the dust, then back at him. She had seen the quiet kindness, the gentle protector. Now she had seen the other side of him, the cold, efficient deadliness. She realized that this man was not just good, he was dangerous. And for the first time since she had met him, a flicker of something other than fear entered her eyes. It was a dawning sense of security, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. She was safe with him not because he was kind, but because he was capable. That night, they made camp in a hidden grove of cottonwoods by a trickling creek. The confrontation had changed something between them. The silence was still there, but it was less fragile, less tense. As Eli sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle with methodical care, she finally spoke, her voice quiet and hesitant. "What is your name?" He looked up, surprised. Eli Thatcher." "My name is Mira," she said. It was a start, a small offering, a bridge across the chasm of their silence. Later, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she spoke again. The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had broken inside her. "I was born in a mining camp in the San Juan Mountains," she began, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "My mother was a widow. She died giving birth to me. The camp foreman, a man named Jebediah Stone, said she owed him money for lodging and supplies. He said I inherited her debt." Eli stopped cleaning his rifle and listened, his heart aching for the story he knew was coming. "I grew up in his house, working for my keep, cleaning, cooking, mending. He was a hard man. He told me every day how much I owed him, how grateful I should be that he didn't just leave me to starve. The debt never went down. It only ever grew. When I was 17, he told me I was old enough to start paying it off in other ways. He sold me to a man who was passing through, a man who supplied girls to saloons and houses all over the territory. He said my debt was finally paid." She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw tears shimmering in her eyes. "My whole life, I was just a debt to be paid." Eli did not know what to say. The simple, brutal cruelty of her story left him speechless. He wanted to offer her words of comfort, but he knew they would be hollow. So he just sat with her in the firelight, his silent presence a testament to his understanding. He had not bought a piece of property. He had rescued a life. 2 days later, they crested a ridge, and Eli reined in his horse, a feeling of homecoming swelling in his chest. Below them lay the valley of the Circle C Ranch, but the feeling quickly turned to ash in his mouth. The valley was empty. The sprawling ranch house was gone, replaced by a blackened, skeletal ruin of charred timbers. The great barn had collapsed in on itself. The corrals were broken and empty. There were no cattle grazing on the hillsides, no smoke rising from the chimney. There was only silence and desolation. Eli stared at the scene, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "No," he whispered. They rode down into the valley, the silence broken only by the crunch of their horses' hooves on the scorched earth. It was even worse up close. The place looked as if the wrath of God had descended upon it. Weeds grew thick among the ruins, a testament to how long it had been abandoned. "What happened here?" Mira asked softly, her voice full of a sympathy that was now for him. "I don't know," Eli said, his voice rough with disbelief. He dismounted and walked through the ruins of the house where he had once eaten at the Abernathy's table, where Mrs. Abernathy had pressed fresh-baked cookies into his hand. It all felt like a dream. He found what he was looking for near the remains of the bunkhouse, a makeshift grave, marked by a simple wooden cross. The name carved into it was weathered but still legible. Jedediah Abernathy, a good man. He had not known. He had been drifting for so long, so cut off from the world, that he had not heard about the range war that had torn through this part of the territory a year ago. A bloody conflict between the ranchers and the homesteaders that had claimed dozens of lives, including that of a good man named Abernathy. The hope he had carried, the one safe harbor he had imagined for Mira, was gone. They were adrift again, with no destination and no plan. They camped that night by the river that ran through the abandoned valley. The ghost of what had been haunted the place, and a deep melancholy settled over Eli. He had failed again. He had promised her safety, and he had led her to a graveyard. Mira seemed to sense his despair. As they sat by the fire, she did something that surprised him. She began to ask about him. "Where did you come from, Eli?" she asked gently. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, the flames reflecting in his haunted eyes. "A small ranch in Texas," he finally said. "My folks died of fever when I was 18. It was just me and my younger sister, Ruth." He paused, the name hanging in the air between them. It had been years since he had said it aloud to another person. She was like a wildfire, full of life. She was only 15. A group of men came to the ranch. They said they were lawmen, but they were liars. They took her. I tried to stop them, but I was just a boy. They beat me and left me for dead." He touched a faint scar above his eyebrow, an old wound that ached with the memory. "I went to the sheriff in town. He listened to my story, and he did nothing. He said they were probably just drifters and she was long gone. He told me to forget about her." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but Mira could feel the raw, ancient pain that lay beneath the surface. "I never saw her again," he finished, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been looking for her, or for the men who took her, ever since." The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence of shared sorrow, of two broken souls finding a strange comfort in each other's pain. Mira looked at his hands, calloused and strong, the hands of a man who had fought and worked and suffered. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and laid her small, trembling hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him willingly. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth and connection in the cold, lonely night. He looked down at their hands, her pale fingers resting on his sun-browned skin. He did not pull away. He simply allowed it, accepting the silent offering of comfort, the unspoken acknowledgement of his grief. They said nothing. They did not need to. In that small, quiet gesture, a bond was forged, stronger than words, in the ashes of their shared pasts. A few days later, their supplies running low, they rode to a small, dusty settlement to trade. As they were leaving, a wagon train was pulling in, a noisy, chaotic procession of families heading west in search of a new life. As they passed the lead wagon, a small boy, no older than 7, who was sitting on the wagon seat next to his father, pointed at Mira. "Look, Pa," the boy said, his voice high and clear. "That lady has a necklace just like the one Sarah had." Eli stopped his horse. He looked at Mira. She was wearing a simple necklace, a small, intricately carved wooden bird on a leather thong. It had been on her when he bought her, one of the few possessions she had. "What did you say, son?" Eli asked the boy, keeping his voice even. The boy's father shushed him, embarrassed, but the boy was insistent. "The girl, Sarah," he said, pointing a grubby finger at Mira's necklace. "The one who was with us for a while, back before the river, the sick one. She had a bird just like that. She said her PA made it for her." Eli's blood ran cold. "What happened to this girl, Sarah?" he asked the father. The man looked uncomfortable. She fell ill, a fever. We had to leave her in the last town, with a doctor. We couldn't risk the whole train." He would not meet Eli's eyes. Eli knew he was lying. He had seen that kind of shame in men's eyes before. They had not left her with a doctor. They had abandoned her. Or worse. But it was the necklace that held his attention. He looked from the boy to Mira, a terrible suspicion beginning to form in his mind. This was no coincidence. A girl named Sarah, part of a wagon train, falling conveniently ill and being left behind. A necklace, identical to Mira's. It was a pattern, a method. He thought of his sister, Ruth, and the men who had taken her. He had always imagined them as brutal thugs. But what if they were smarter than that? What if they operated with a terrible subtlety, preying on the weak, the isolated, the forgotten? What if the web was larger and more insidious than he had ever imagined? He looked at Mira, truly looked at her, and saw not just a woman he had rescued, but a clue, a link in a chain that stretched back a decade, a chain that might, if he could only follow it, lead him to the truth of what had happened to his sister. His personal act of salvation had just become something more. It had become a hunt. The journey north was a baptism by ice. They left the sun-blasted reds and oranges of the Arizona desert behind, climbing steadily into a world that grew colder and harder with each passing day. The air thinned, turning crisp and sharp in their lungs. The sparse, thorny vegetation gave way to vast forests of pine and aspen, their branches heavy with the first snows of a long winter. For Eli, the changing landscape mirrored the shift in his own soul. The vague, 10-year search for a ghost had sharpened to a single point. He was no longer just drifting. He was hunting, and the name of his prey was Cobb. He had heard the name before, in hushed conversations in the back rooms of saloons and around lonely campfires. Jeremiah Cobb was a man who dealt in commodities the law frowned upon: guns, whiskey, and human lives. He was a shadow, moving between remote mining camps and frontier towns where a man with a full purse and no morals could operate freely. The rumor that had finally stuck in Eli's craw was that Cobb had a base of operations in the Colorado Highlands, in a silver boomtown called Silver Creek. It was a long shot, a threadbare lead, but it was the only one he had. Mira rode beside him, no longer a frightened passenger, but a silent partner. She had mended his spare shirt, her stitches small and neat. She helped pack their supplies in the morning with a quiet efficiency, her movements economical and sure. The fear had not vanished from her eyes, but it was no longer the all-consuming terror it had been. It had been replaced by a watchful resolve. She had seen him face down men who meant to do her harm, and she had decided to place her fragile trust in his hands. "This town, Silver Creek," she said one afternoon. her breath pluming in the cold air. "It will be dangerous." "All towns are," Eli answered, his gaze scanning the snow-dusted peaks ahead. "This one's more dangerous than most." He looked at her, his expression serious. "When we get there, we can't be a man traveling with a woman he just bought. People will ask questions we can't answer. It'll draw the wrong kind of attention." Mira waited, her dark eyes fixed on his face. "We'll need a story," he said. "We're a married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, heading west to start a new life. Simple, forgettable." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, confusion, something else he could not name. She simply nodded. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith," she repeated softly, testing the names on her tongue as if they were foreign and strange. Silver Creek was a gash of civilization carved into the side of a mountain, a chaotic collection of raw timber buildings clinging to a single, muddy street churned by the hooves of mules and the boots of 1,000 miners. Snow lay thick on the rooftops and was piled in dirty banks along the boardwalks. The air was sharp with the scent of pine smoke and the clang of a distant blacksmith's hammer. It was a town built on desperation and the fleeting promise of silver, a place where a man's life was worth less than an ounce of the precious metal he dug from the frozen earth. They found a room at the town's only boarding house, a drafty 2-story affair run by a weary-looking woman with kind eyes named Mrs. Gable. Eli signed the register as E. Smith, paid for a week in advance, and carried their meager belongings up the creaking stairs. The room was small, containing little more than a lumpy bed, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a small cast-iron stove that radiated a meager warmth. As he set their things down, Mira stood by the single window, looking out at the bleak street below. She seemed smaller in this cold, closed-in space, a fragile bird far from any familiar roost, to the outside world. They were now husband and wife. The thought sent a nervous tremor through her. When Eli went back downstairs to see to the horses, she wrapped her arms around herself, a strange mixture of fear and an even stranger sense of excitement churning within her. Over the next 2 days, the pretense became a strange sort of reality. When they walked through the town, she would take his arm, a gesture born of the need for appearances that soon began to feel natural, protective. She found herself watching him, the way his quiet gray eyes missed nothing, the way he moved with a confident grace that belied the danger he was courting. In the evenings, they would eat a silent dinner in the common room downstairs, and the other boarders would nod to them, accepting them as the simple, unremarkable couple they pretended to be. Mira had never known such a thing. She had only ever been a debt, a piece of property. To be seen as a wife, even in pretense, was to be seen as a person, and to her own astonishment, she began to enjoy the role more than she ever would have thought possible. It was a glimpse of a life she had never dared to dream of. On their 3rd night in Silver Creek, a blizzard descended on the town, burying it in a fresh blanket of white and howling like a famished wolf outside their small window. The room was cold, the stove fighting a losing battle against the drafts that snaked through the floorboards. Eli had given her the bed, as he always did, and had laid his bedroll out on the floor. He was staring into the fire, the orange light flickering across his weathered face, highlighting the grim set of his jaw. He had spent the last 2 days asking quiet questions in the town saloons, gathering whispers about Jeremiah Cobb. He had learned that Cobb was indeed in town, that he kept a private room at the largest saloon, the North Star, and that he met with men who, like him, preferred to do their business in the shadows. Eli was getting closer, and the proximity to the man who had helped destroy his life was winding him tighter than a watch spring. Mira watched him from the bed, a thick quilt pulled up to her chin. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the deep, lonely sorrow in his eyes. He was a man carrying a burden so heavy it threatened to crush him, an impulse, born of gratitude and a confusing, blossoming affection, rose up in her. She slipped out of the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. She came to stand behind him, a small, hesitant figure in the firelight. He did not seem to notice her at first, lost in his own dark thoughts. She reached out a trembling hand and gently touched his shoulder. He started, his head snapping around, his eyes wide and for a moment, unguarded. He saw her standing there, her dark hair unbound, her face soft with a concern that was entirely genuine. The air in the room grew thick, charged with all the things that had been left unsaid between them. Slowly, she leaned down. Her face was close to his, her breath warm against his cheek. She was going to kiss him. It was a gesture of comfort, of thanks, an attempt to reach the man inside the hardened shell. But he turned his head at the last moment. Her lips brushed against the rough stubble of his cheek. He raised his hand and gently, almost regretfully, placed it on her shoulder, pushing her back. The rejection was not harsh, but it was absolute. Mira's eyes filled with confusion and the sting of shame. She pulled back, wrapping her arms around herself again. Eli's voice was low, rough with an emotion she could not decipher. "Mira, not like this." She started, her voice a whisper. He stood up, turning to face her fully. He was so tall, so imposing, and yet his eyes were full of a strange sadness. "I know what you were doing," he said, "but it can't be like this. Not because you feel you owe me something, not ever." He saw the hurt in her eyes and his own heart ached. He was trying to protect her, to give her the one thing no one else ever had, a choice, completely free and unburdened by debt or gratitude. But he was a man of few words, and he did not know how to explain the fierce, protective principle that guided him. He needed her to be free, not just in body, but in spirit, and any affection that might grow between them had to be planted in that free soil, or it would not be real. "Get back in bed," he said, his voice softer now. "You'll catch your death of cold." She retreated, the space between them once again a vast, unbridgeable distance. The next day, Eli found his opening. He sent word through a nervous-looking bartender that a man named Smith was in town with a good bit of cash, looking to buy a dozen Winchester rifles, with no bill of sale and no questions asked. An hour later, the reply came. Mr. Cobb would see him. Midnight, in the back room of the North Star. That night, Eli checked his Colt, making sure the action was smooth. Mira watched him, her heart pounding. "Let me come with you," she said. "No," he answered immediately. "It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous if you go alone," she insisted. "They will expect a man like you to be alone. They won't be looking at his wife." Her eyes met his, full of a fierce determination he had not seen before. "We are in this together. Eli, you did not leave me in Caldera Gulch. I will not leave you now." He saw the steel in her gaze and knew that arguing would be useless. He finally gave a single, reluctant nod. The North Star Saloon was a den of noise and smoke. They walked in together, Mira on Eli's arm, playing the part of a nervous wife out of her element. They drew a few curious looks, but no one paid them much mind. Eli led them to the back, to a door guarded by a man with a face like a clenched fist. Eli gave the name Smith, and the guard grunted and stepped aside. The room was small and hazy with cigar smoke. A single lamp cast a greasy yellow light on a round table where two men sat playing cards. One was the guard from the door. The other man made the air leave Eli's lungs. He was older than Eli remembered, his hair thinning and streaked with gray. But the face was the same. The cold, reptilian eyes, the thin, cruel slash of a mouth, the jagged white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. It was him, Jeremiah Cobb, one of the men who had ridden away with his sister, laughing as she screamed his name. 10 years of cold fury, of a hatred that had been banked but never extinguished, roared to life inside Eli. The room seemed to shrink, the noise of the saloon fading to a distant buzz. All he could see was Cobb's face. All he could feel was the weight of the Colt on his hip. His hand began to move, and unconscious, instinctual motion. He was going to draw. He was going to kill this man. Right here. Right now. And damn the consequences. It was Mira who saved him. She felt the rigid tension that seized his body, saw the murderous look in his eyes. Her hand tightened on his arm, her nails digging into his flesh. A small, sharp anchor in the storm of his rage. The pressure was just enough to break the spell. Eli froze, his fingers hovering inches from the butt of his gun. Cobb looked them over, his eyes lingering on Mira with a proprietary air that made Eli's blood boil. "So, you're Smith," Cobb said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "And this is the missus? A bit pretty for a man in your line of work, ain't she?" Eli forced himself to breathe. He forced the rage down, burying it deep. "She stays with me," he said, his voice tight. "I hear you want to buy some rifles," Cobb said, gesturing to the empty chairs. "Sit. Have a drink." He poured 3 glasses of whiskey from a bottle on the table. Eli's mind was racing. He needed information. Killing Cobb would be a release, but it would not tell him what had happened to Ruth. He had to play the part. They sat, the air thick with menace. As Cobb spoke, detailing the price and quality of the guns he could provide, Mira watched Eli. She saw the tremor in his hand as he lifted his glass, the vein throbbing in his temple. He was a powder keg with a lit fuse, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he would not be able to hold on for much longer. He was going to lose control, and they were both going to die in this filthy little room. She had to do something. Her mind flashed to the small packet of white powder she had bought from an old woman in a dusty border town weeks ago. The woman had sold it to her as a sleeping draught, but had warned her that a full dose in a strong drink could be permanent. A last resort for a woman in trouble. Mira had carried it with her ever since, a secret, desperate talisman. It was in a small pocket sewn into the seam of her dress. Her decision was instantaneous. As Cobb turned to spit a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon, Mira's hand moved with lightning speed. She shielded her motion with her body, her fingers finding the small packet. With a flick of her wrist, she emptied the contents into Cobb's whiskey glass. The powder dissolved instantly in the amber liquid. It was a desperate, foolish gamble. But she was not just saving Eli from his own rage. She was trying to give him the justice he had sought for a decade. Cobb turned back, picked up his glass, and raised it in a mock toast. "To new business partners," he sneered. But as he brought the glass to his lips, he paused. Perhaps it was a flicker of movement he had caught out of the corner of his eye. Perhaps it was the unnatural stillness of the 2 people sitting opposite him. Or perhaps it was simply the ingrained paranoia of a man who had lived his entire life among wolves. His eyes narrowed, and he stared down into his glass. He swirled the liquid, and for a half-second, a faint, unnatural shimmer caught the lamplight. His face changed. The sneer vanished, replaced by a look of cold, murderous fury. He slammed the glass down on the table, the whiskey sloshing over the rim. "What did you do?" he hissed, his eyes locking on Mira. Time stopped. Then everything exploded into motion. Cobb lunged across the table, his hand clawing for Mira. At the same instant, Eli kicked the table over, sending cards and glasses crashing to the floor. The guard by the door was drawing his gun, but Eli was faster. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand. He fired once, the shot deafening in the small room. The guard grunted and crumpled to the floor. Eli grabbed Mira, pulling her toward a back door he had noticed when they entered. Cobb was on his feet, his own gun out, roaring with rage. A bullet splintered the door frame next to Eli's head. He shoved Mira through the door and into a narrow, snow-filled alley, firing back into the room to cover their retreat. They ran, slipping and sliding in the deep snow. Shouts and gunshots erupted behind them. A searing pain shot through Mira's left shoulder, and she cried out, stumbling. Eli caught her before she fell. He saw the dark stain spreading on the sleeve of her dress. She'd been hit. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his battle-honed calm. He scooped her up into his arms and ran, plunging into the labyrinth of dark alleys behind the saloon, the blizzard swallowing them up, their only ally in a town that now wanted them dead. He did not stop running until the shouts and gunshots had faded behind them. Lost in the howl of the wind, he found an abandoned trapper's cabin on the edge of the woods, a half-rotten structure barely visible in the swirling snow. He kicked the door in and carried her inside, laying her gently on the dirt floor. He tore a strip from his shirt and, with trembling hands, ripped open the sleeve of her dress. The bullet had only grazed her, a raw, bloody furrow across the flesh of her shoulder. It was not deep, but it was bleeding freely. His carefully constructed composure shattered. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from a terror so profound it threatened to unman him. The thought of losing her, of her dying in some filthy alley because of his quest for vengeance, was a pain sharper than any bullet. He packed the wound with the clean cloth, his touch surprisingly gentle. Mira looked up at him, her face pale with pain and shock, tears freezing on her cheeks.
"I'm sorry, Eli," she whispered, her teeth chattering. I saw your face. I wanted to give you closure."
He finished tying the makeshift bandage, his knuckles white. He looked at her, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce, raw emotion she had never seen before. "I'd rather have you alive than have my revenge," he said, his voice thick and cracking. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. He was not just her protector. She was not just a woman he had saved. They were something more. The cabin was freezing, the wind finding every crack in the old logs. He built a small, smoky fire, but it was not enough. He looked at her, shivering violently on the floor, and then at his bedroll. He laid it out, and then, without a word, he lay down beside her and pulled the thick wool blanket over both of them. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his chest. Her body was cold and trembling, but she leaned into his warmth, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. It was not a gesture of passion, but something far deeper. It was two people, alone and broken, clinging to each other for warmth and for life in the heart of a storm. And for the first time, lying in the arms of this dangerous, gentle man, Mira felt no fear, only a profound, aching sense of having come home. They lay like that for a long time, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire. "Sometimes," Mira whispered into the darkness, her voice small and fragile, "I have dreams about a little house with a fence and flowers. I would have chickens." She gave a small, watery laugh. "It's a silly dream." Eli held her tighter, his own heart aching. He thought of the life he might have had, the peace he had never known. "It's not a silly dream," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It's the only dream worth having." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with a decade of loss. "I haven't known a home since the day my sister vanished. The morning after the blizzard broke white and silent, the world outside the trapper's cabin remade. The snow was a clean, deep blanket covering the sins of the forest, the sunlight on its surface so bright it hurt the eyes, but the peace was deceptive. It was the calm of a graveyard. Inside the small cabin, the air was thick with the unspoken truths of the night before. Eli had held her, and in that simple act of shared warmth, a line had been crossed. They were no longer just a protector and his ward. Their fates were now inextricably, intimately entwined. Eli was cleaning his weapons when Mira, her shoulder bound in a fresh bandage, spoke into the quiet. Her voice was no longer hesitant. The fear was still a shadow in her eyes, but it was overshadowed now by a hard, clear resolve he had never seen before. "Cobb will not let this go," she said, her gaze steady on his. "He will send men. We cannot stay here. We cannot go back." Eli nodded, not looking up from the intricate mechanics of his Colt. I know. When you spoke to those men in the saloon, you said you were looking to buy rifles, she continued, her logic sharp and clear. You said your name was Smith. Cobb knows that was a lie. He knows you came for him. He will wonder why. Let him wonder, Eli said, his voice flat. No, Mira insisted, taking a step closer. We cannot let him wonder. We have to finish this. She took a breath, her resolve hardening. Before we were forced to run, I heard him talking to the guard. He mentioned his partner, a man named Marston, in a place called Santa Rosa. He said Marston had the ledgers. Eli's hand stilled. He looked up at her, his gray eyes dark and dangerous. What ledgers? Records, she said, of all their business, everything, everyone. The name Marston was not new to Eli. It was the other half of the ghost he had been chasing, the man rumored to be the true power behind the trafficking ring. Santa Rosa was his fortress, a sprawling ranch and brothel compound south of the territory line, a place from which no secrets and few women ever escaped. He had always known he would have to go there eventually, but now, with Mira wounded, with the stakes so brutally personal, the thought of it was a cold weight in his gut. His first overwhelming instinct was to take her somewhere, anywhere, safe. It is too dangerous, he said, his voice rough. Marston's place is guarded by mercenaries. It's a fortress. And what is our alternative? She countered, her voice rising with a passion he had never heard from her. To run for the rest of our lives? To wait for men like Cobb and Finch to find us? I've been running my entire life. Eli, I will not run anymore. She stepped closer still, her hand resting on his arm. Her touch was warm, urgent. Your sister's name might be in those ledgers. This is not just your fight anymore. They did this to me, too. They did this to countless other women. We have to go to Santa Rosa. He looked into her eyes and saw not the frightened woman he had carried out of a dusty yard, but a warrior. The fire he had seen flickering in her gaze that day was now a steady, burning flame. She was right. To run would be a slower, more agonizing kind of death. They had kicked the hornet's nest, and the only way out was to burn it to the ground. All right, Mira, he said, his voice a low rumble. We go to Santa Rosa. The journey south was a descent back into a harsher, less forgiving world. They left the snows of the high country behind, trading the silent pines for the thorny scrub of the plains. As they traveled, a new routine settled between them. One afternoon, as they made camp in the shelter of a rocky outcropping, Eli unbuckled his gun belt and held it out to her. You need to learn, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mira looked at the heavy Colt Peacemaker, its wooden grip worn smooth, its long barrel a dull, deadly blue. She had seen what this weapon could do. The thought of holding it, of using it, sent a tremor of fear through her. I cannot, she whispered. You must, Eli insisted, his voice gentle but firm. I cannot be with you every second of every day. If the time comes, you need to be able to defend yourself. You cannot be helpless again. I will not allow it. Reluctantly, she took the gun. Its weight was shocking. A solid, brutal reality in her hand. The oily scent of gunmetal filled her nostrils. Eli showed her how to hold it, how to check the chambers, how to cock the hammer. His hands were patient and sure, guiding hers. Then he stood behind her, his body a warm, solid presence at her back, his arm coming around to steady her own. Find a target, he murmured, his voice close to her ear. He pointed to a weathered piece of driftwood leaning against a rock 50 feet away. Do not think about a man. Do not think about anything but that piece of wood. Breathe out and squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. His hand was over hers, his fingers firm on her own. She closed her eyes for a second, took a shaky breath, and then opened them. Focusing on the target, she squeezed. The explosion was deafening, a sharp crack that shattered the afternoon stillness. The gun kicked hard against her palm, and she cried out, stumbling back against Eli's chest. He held her steady. A splinter of wood flew from the target. She had hit it. They practiced for an hour, until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. With each shot, her fear receded, replaced by a growing sense of control. The gun was no longer just an instrument of violence. It was a promise that she would never again be a passive victim of another's cruelty. The long days on the trail blurred together, and the space between them shrank. The formal distance they had once maintained had been burned away in the fire and ice of Silver Creek. Their shared danger and the intimacy of the cabin had forged a new bond, one that manifested itself in small, quiet gestures. Mira began to initiate them. As he studied a map, her hand would rest lightly on his arm as she pointed to a landmark. In the morning, she would fix the collar of his shirt, her fingers brushing against the warm skin of his neck for a fleeting moment. One evening, she reached out and brushed a speck of dust from his jacket, her touch lingering just a second longer than necessary. Each time, Eli would grow still, a man unaccustomed to such casual, gentle contact, but he never pulled away. These small acts of tenderness were like rain on the parched ground of his soul. He had been alone for so long, wrapped in a cloak of grief and vengeance, that he had forgotten what it felt to be cared for. One night, they sat by a fire that cast their long shadows against the canyon wall. The desert sky was a vast, dark ocean of stars. Mira had been mending a tear in his blanket, her head bent over her work, the firelight catching the soft curve of her cheek. She looked up and found him watching her, his expression one of a deep, aching tenderness that made her heart catch in her throat. He had laid out his bedroll for her and was preparing his own on the other side of the fire. As she finished her work, she stood and walked over to him. She took the extra blanket, the one he used in the coldest weather, and draped it over his shoulders. "You will be cold tonight," she said softly. He caught her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. He did not let go. "Mira," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. He looked at her, his stormy eyes full of a truth that was both a burden and a salvation. "I love you." The words, so simple and direct, hung in the silent air between them. Mira's breath hitched. 1,000 emotions washed over her, shock, joy, a hope so fierce it was painful. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him that she felt it too, this powerful, terrifying, wonderful thing that had grown between them in the dust and the danger. But he raised a finger to her lips, silencing her. "Do not say anything," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Not yet." He stood, but he did not pull her closer. Instead, he took a small step back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I will not touch you, Mira, not as a man touches a woman, not until you can look me in the eye and say those words back to me. And I know, and you know, that you are saying them because you are free, not because you are grateful, not because you are scared, not because you feel you owe me a debt." His eyes bored into hers, full of a fierce, desperate sincerity. "When you say it, it has to be your choice, and only your choice. Do you understand?" Tears welled in her eyes and traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. She understood. He was giving her the one thing no one ever had, the freedom to choose. She could not speak. She simply nodded, her heart so full it felt as if it might break. They reached the outskirts of Santa Rosa a week later. Marston's ranch was everything the rumors had claimed. It was less a ranch and more a fortified compound, surrounded by a high adobe wall topped with broken glass. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their rifles glinting in the sun. The main house was a grand, sprawling hacienda, a testament to the wealth Marston had wrung from human misery. Set apart from it, almost hidden from view, was a long, low, barracks-like building with barred windows. Eli knew instinctively that this was where the women were kept. They watched the compound for 2 days from a hidden vantage point in the hills, studying the guards' routines, the comings and goings of supply wagons. They planned their entry for the dead of night, during the changing of the guard. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, they moved like shadows. They scaled the wall at a dark corner, dropping silently into the compound. They crept along the walls, their hearts pounding in time with their furtive footsteps. Their target was a small office building attached to the main house, a place where Eli reasoned the records would be kept. The window was unlocked. Eli slipped inside, then helped Mira through. The room was dark, smelling of stale cigar smoke and leather. Eli lit a match, the small flame flaring to life, and used it to light a lantern, turning the wick down so it cast only a dim, furtive glow. The office was meticulously organized. A large oak desk stood in the center, and one wall was lined with filing cabinets and shelves filled with thick, leather-bound ledgers. They began their search. Ledger after ledger was filled with the cold, hard calculus of Marston's business. Supplies bought, cattle sold, wages paid. Then they found it, a locked cabinet in a corner. Eli used his knife to jimmy the lock, and it swung open to reveal a dozen more ledgers, these different from the others. He opened the first one. His blood ran cold. It was a list of names, girls' names. Beside each name was an age, a point of acquisition, and a price. It was a catalog of stolen lives. They searched frantically, their hands shaking, their breath held tight in their chests. And then, in a ledger dated 10 years prior, Mira found it. Her finger traced a line of elegant cursive. Ruth Thatcher, 15, Thatcher Ranch, TX. Beside the entry, a price had been written. But unlike the other entries, there was no destination listed. Instead, a single, brutal line had been drawn through her name, an erasure, a final, dismissive stroke of a pen. Eli stared at the page, the world narrowing to that single line. His sister's life, reduced to a name in a book, crossed out like a debt that had been settled. The rage, the grief, the decade of searching, all of it coalesced into a single point of unbearable pain. He could not breathe. "Eli," Mira whispered, her voice tight with a discovery of her own. She was holding a small, worn book, not a ledger, but a diary. She had found it tucked behind the ledgers, hidden away. She opened it, her hands trembling, and read aloud in the dim lantern light. October 12th. Another new girl arrived today. Her name is Ruth. She is not like the others. She does not cry. She watches everything with eyes that burn. She told me tonight that we are not broken things. She told me she will get us out of here. Mira flipped a few pages. Her voice was choked with emotion. November 3rd. Ruth tried it tonight. She stole a key and got 3 of the younger girls out through the kitchen. But they were caught at the wall. Marston, what he did to her. I cannot write it. They dragged her away. I do not think we will see her again. But she was so brave. She smiled at us as they took her. She smiled. The truth hit Eli with the force of a physical blow. Ruth had not been just another victim. She had been a fighter. She had died not in quiet despair, but in a blaze of defiance, trying to save others. The thought was both a comfort and an agony beyond measure. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside the office. They froze, extinguishing the lantern. The door handle began to turn. They had no time to think. Eli grabbed Mira and pulled her behind the heavy desk just as the door swung open. A man entered, a ranch hand carrying a lantern of his own. He walked to a shelf, took a bottle of whiskey, and turned to leave. His lantern light swept across the floor, illuminating the open, empty cabinet. He stopped. "What the—" Before he could shout, a voice came from the doorway. "Looking for something, Pablo?" It was another man, older, his voice weary. He saw what Pablo was looking at, and his eyes widened. He quickly stepped into the room and closed the door. "Get out of here," the old man hissed. "Now, you saw nothing." "But the ledgers," Pablo stammered. "Do you want to end up hanging from the cottonwoods?" the old man whispered fiercely. "Marston executes anyone who digs into his past. I know. I've seen it. Now get out. I will fix this." Pablo fled. The old man sighed, running a hand over his face. He walked over to the cabinet, his back to the desk where Eli and Mira were hidden. It was their only chance. Eli grabbed Mira's hand, and they bolted from the room, past the stunned old man, and out into the night. An alarm bell began to ring, its frantic clang shattering the silence. Shouts erupted from the main house. They ran, their lungs burning, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. They scrambled over the wall, dropping into the darkness outside the compound, and did not stop running until the sounds of the ranch had faded far behind them. They collapsed miles away, in a dry riverbed, hidden from view. The adrenaline faded, leaving only a vast, hollow emptiness. Eli knelt in the sand, his head in his hands. A dry, ragged sob tore from his throat, then another. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart for 10 long years crumbled into dust. He wept, for the sister he had lost, for the brave woman she had become, for the years of searching that had ended here, in this dark and dusty place, with a truth more painful than any he could have imagined. Mira knelt beside him. She did not speak. She simply wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he had held her in the snowbound cabin. She was no longer the one who needed saving. In this moment, she was his anchor, his strength. He leaned into her embrace, his body shaking with the force of a decade of unshed grief. After a long time, his sobs subsided, replaced by a shuddering silence. He finally looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, his eyes full of a raw, naked pain. "She died trying to save them," he whispered, his voice broken. "It was for nothing." Mira looked at him, her own eyes shining with tears, but her voice was steady and clear, a beacon in his darkness. "Maybe she did," she said softly, her hand stroking his hair. "But then she saved me too." They fled south from Santa Rosa with the ghosts of Marston's compound at their heels. The knowledge they carried was a dangerous burden. It was not just the memory of what they had seen in the ledgers, but the stark, undeniable truth that they were now fugitives. They were no longer just running from Mira's past, but from Eli's as well. The two had merged, becoming a single, relentless pursuer. Every rider on the horizon was a potential threat, every campfire in the distance a possible enemy. For weeks they traveled hard, sticking to the forgotten trails and dry riverbeds. Their existence pared down to the simple, brutal necessities of survival. They were two solitary figures in a vast, indifferent landscape. But even in the wilderness, they knew they could not hide forever. They needed to disappear, to melt into a larger current that would carry them west, away from the territories where the names Marston and Cobb were law. It was in a dusty, wind-scoured trading post that they heard the rumor. A woman, a former dance hall madam from Denver named Hattie, was gathering a different kind of wagon train. It was not for families seeking land, but for women seeking escape. Saloon girls, dancers, soiled doves, all of them pooling their meager savings to buy wagons and disguise themselves as a respectable caravan of widows and sisters heading for the coast. They were looking for a new life, and they knew their only chance was to find it together. It was a desperate, audacious plan, and for Eli and Mira, it was a godsend. They found the caravan camped in a hidden valley a week later. It was a small, ragtag assembly of about a dozen wagons, many in need of repair, pulled by weary-looking mules and oxen. The women who gathered around their fire as Eli and Mira rode in were a study in resilience. Their faces were hard, their eyes wary and old before their time, but there was a fierce, defiant spark in them. Hattie, a tall, raw-boned woman with iron-gray hair and a gaze that missed nothing, stepped forward to meet them. "We are not looking for passengers," she said, her voice flat, her hand resting on the butt of a pistol tucked into her waistband. "We are not looking for a ride," Eli answered, his own voice quiet and steady. He dismounted, standing before her not as a threat, but as a man making a proposal. "We are looking for anonymity. You are a group of women traveling alone. You need a gun. I am offering mine." He gestured to Mira, who sat straight and proud on her horse. "In exchange, my wife and I become just two more faces in your caravan. No questions asked." Hattie's eyes appraised him, then moved to Mira. She saw the fine, almost invisible scars of a hard life, the same scars she saw on the face of every woman in her charge. She saw the way the man stood, his body subtly positioned to shield the woman, a silent protector. She saw the way the woman looked at him, not with fear, but with a fierce, unwavering trust. "One gun is not much against the kind of trouble this world can throw at a wagon train of women," Hattie said, her voice still skeptical. "It is one more than you have now," Eli replied simply. Hattie was silent for a long moment, the other women watching, waiting for her judgment. Finally, she gave a short, decisive nod. "You can ride with us, Mr. Smith," Eli said. "My wife, Mira." And so they were absorbed. They became two more shadows in a caravan of them, their pasts packed away like worn-out clothes. But a past, Eli knew, was a stubborn thing. It had a way of catching up. Life on the trail was a rhythm of hardship and shared labor. Each dawn was a struggle against the cold. Each day a long, slow battle against the dust, the heat, and the endless miles. But for Mira, it was a kind of salvation. For the first time in her life, she was surrounded by women who understood her without needing a single word of explanation. They had all walked the same shadowed paths, had all borne the same burdens of shame and survival. In the beginning, she was quiet, content to listen as they talked around the nightly fires. She listened to their stories, tales of betrayal, of cruelty, but also of small victories and defiant laughter. She saw their kindness to one another, the way they would share a bit of sugar or help mend a torn dress. A young girl named Clara, barely 16 and with eyes that still held a flicker of innocence, attached herself to Mira, and Mira found herself teaching the girl how to braid her hair, her fingers moving with a gentle, forgotten tenderness. Slowly, tentatively, Mira began to emerge from the fortress she had built around her soul. One evening, as a woman named Josie was weeping over a letter from a family that had disowned her, Mira sat beside her and took her hand. She did not offer platitudes. She simply said, "I know." And in those two words, a lifetime of shared understanding passed between them. A few nights later, when one of the wagons broke an axle in the middle of a river crossing, it was Mira who, remembering something she had seen a ranch hand do years ago, showed them how to lever it up with a fallen log, her voice clear and confident as she gave directions. The other women began to see her not as the quiet, haunted woman who had joined them, but as a source of strength, and as she gave her strength to them, she found it multiplying within herself. One night, a woman told a bawdy, funny story about a pompous sheriff in a Kansas cow town, and Mira laughed. It was not a small, hesitant sound, but a full, genuine laugh that bubbled up from deep inside her. Eli, sitting on the far side of the fire, heard it, and the sound was more beautiful to him than any music. He saw her face, illuminated by the firelight, her eyes shining, and he realized he was watching a miracle. He was watching a soul come back to life. For the first time, Mira began to believe that she was not a broken thing. But the world outside their small, moving sanctuary had not forgotten them. When they stopped for supplies in a small, fly-specked town, Eli saw the poster nailed to the sheriff's office. It was a crude, woodcut drawing, but the descriptions were unmistakable. $1,000 for a tall, quiet man named Eli Thatcher and a dark-haired woman known as Mira, wanted for theft and murder in Silver Creek, signed by order of Silas Marston. The bounty changed everything. That night, the news spread through the caravan like a sickness. Fear, sharp and acidic, poisoned the camaraderie. A few of the women argued that Eli and Mira should be cast out, that they were bringing a death sentence down on all of them. It was Hattie who silenced them. She stood before the assembled women, her face grim in the firelight. "Every one of us is running from a man like Marston," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "Every one of us has a bounty on our soul, if not on our head. These two are no different from us. They are just a little further down the same road. We do not leave our own behind. We will be more careful. We will watch our back trail, but we will not run." Her words settled the matter, but a new tension hung over the caravan. They were no longer just settlers. They were fugitives, harboring wanted criminals. The danger seemed to draw Eli and Mira even closer. The unspoken truths between them had blossomed into a quiet, profound intimacy. One night, as they sat a little apart from the main campfire, watching the stars prick the vast, black canvas of the sky, Eli turned to her. He had been watching her all evening as she helped Clara learn to read from a tattered primer, her patience and gentleness a wonder to behold. "I have never seen anyone so brave," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a compliment on her looks or her spirit. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, of the incredible journey she had made from the terrified creature on the auction block to the woman she was now. It was the highest praise he could give. Mira looked at him, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it stole her breath. This man, who had seen the absolute worst of her, the most shamed and broken version of herself, saw her as brave. He had given her back her life, and now he was giving her back her self-respect. She leaned forward, her hand coming up to cup his jaw, her fingers tracing the rugged line of his face. She kissed him. It was not the hesitant, questioning gesture of the girl in the snowbound cabin. It was the kiss of a woman, a free woman, full of a deep, certain love. It was a kiss that held all the unspoken gratitude, all the shared pain, all the fierce, bright hope for a future she had never thought she would have. This time, he did not pull away. His arms came around her, pulling her close, his own lips answering the desperate, tender pressure of hers. The kiss was a long, slow drowning, a world of sensation after a lifetime of drought. It was a promise made in the silent, star-dusted darkness, a vow that they were no longer two separate, broken people, but one. The ambush came 3 days later, at dawn. They were breaking camp in a narrow canyon, the morning air still cold and sharp. When the first shot rang out, it was followed by a volley of rifle fire from the canyon rim above them. Chaos erupted. Women screamed. Horses neighed in terror, and the air filled with the whine of bullets and the splintering of wood. Eli reacted instantly, his Colt in his hand, shoving Mira behind the relative safety of a wagon wheel. "Stay down!" he roared. He saw them then, a dozen riders, their faces hard and cruel, firing down into the camp with a cold, professional efficiency. Bounty hunters. Marston's men. Eli returned fire, his shots measured and deadly. He saw one of the riders clutch his chest and topple from his horse, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Trapped in the narrow canyon floor, he saw Hattie go down, a dark stain spreading across her chest. He saw Clara, the young girl Mira had been teaching, lying still beside a water barrel. The scene was a nightmare of blood and terror. He was reloading, his movements swift and sure. When a searing pain tore through his side, he grunted, stumbling back, a bullet having grazed his ribs. Before he could recover, another man, who had circled around behind them on foot, brought the butt of his rifle down hard on Eli's head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, and then everything went black. He came to slowly, the world swimming back into focus through a haze of agony. The side of his head was a sticky, matted mess of blood, and his ribs screamed with every breath. The shooting had stopped. A terrible, unnatural silence hung over the canyon, broken only by the soft groans of the wounded. The air smelled of gunpowder and death. He pushed himself up, his vision clearing. The bounty hunters were gone, and so was Mira. He saw the drag marks in the dirt leading away from the wagon where he had last seen her. A frantic, animal terror, cold and absolute, seized him. They had taken her. The nightmare had come true again. He had failed. He had let them take her. He staggered through the carnage of the camp, his grief a physical weight pressing down on him. Hattie was dead. Clara was dead. Half the women of the caravan were dead or dying. A handful of survivors huddled together, their faces blank with shock. One of them, a woman named Sally, came to him, her face streaked with tears and dirt. She pressed a canteen of water and a strip of jerky into his hand.
"They went north,"
she whispered, her voice a hoarse croak.
"Go, get her back!"
Eli looked at her, then at the devastation around him. He was alone, wounded, half dead. But the fire that had driven him for 10 years had been rekindled into a raging inferno. He was no longer hunting for justice or for the ghost of his sister. He was hunting for his life, for Mira. He took the supplies, found his horse, and without a backward glance, he rode north. His entire world narrowed to the single, desperate purpose of finding her. For 2 days, he rode across a scorched, merciless desert. The sun was a hammer, the heat a physical entity that beat down on him, sucking the moisture from his body. The wound in his side throbbed with every step of his horse, and his head felt as if it might split open. He pushed on, fueled by a rage so pure it burned away the pain. He was a superb tracker, and the bounty hunters, confident in their numbers, had grown careless. He found their trail, a dropped glove, the specific print of a shod horse, the ashes of a hastily extinguished fire. He found their camp on the evening of the second day, nestled in a box canyon. He left his horse a mile back and approached on foot, moving with the silence of a wraith. He crawled to the edge of the canyon rim and looked down. There were 4 of them. They were laughing and drinking around a fire, celebrating their payday. And tied to the wheel of a supply wagon was Mira. Her face was bruised, her lips split. She had been beaten, but she was not broken. Her head was held high, and in her eyes, as she stared at the men who held her captive, was a look of such pure, unadulterated hatred that it made Eli's heart swell with a fierce, terrible pride. She had not given up. She would never give up. Eli watched them, his mind cold and clear, his rage a sharpened blade. He planned his attack. He would wait for the deepest point of the night, when the whiskey had made them slow and the fire had burned low. He attacked just before dawn, a phantom of vengeance descending from the darkness. The man on watch never saw him coming. Eli's knife was a swift, silent whisper in the dark. The man crumpled without a sound. Eli moved to the fire, his Colt in his hand. The other 3 were asleep in their bedrolls. He kicked the nearest one awake. The man sat up, his eyes wide and confused, and found himself staring down the barrel of Eli's pistol. "Wake your friends," Eli said, his voice a low, deadly growl. The man, trembling, did as he was told. The other 2 scrambled awake, reaching for their guns. It was a fatal mistake. Eli's Colt bucked twice in his hand, the shots echoing like thunder in the confined space of the canyon. The 2 men fell back, their lives extinguished before they were even fully awake. The last man, the one Eli had woken first, was on his knees now, his hands raised, his face a mask of terror. "Please," he whimpered, tears streaming down his face. "Please, mister, do not kill me. I will give you anything. Just let me live." Eli walked slowly toward him, the hammer of his Colt cocked, the sound a final, definitive click in the sudden silence. He looked at the man, this sniveling creature who had helped slaughter innocent women, who had beaten the woman he loved. He saw no humanity in him, only a void. "You already threw it away," Eli said. His voice as cold and empty as the desert night. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was the last sound. Silence descended on the canyon, a silence broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. Eli stood there for a moment, the smoke curling from the barrel of his gun, a solitary, grim figure in the first pale light of dawn. Then he turned and walked to Mira. He knelt before her, his hands shaking as he cut the ropes that bound her. She looked at him, her bruised face illuminated by the firelight, her eyes searching his. He was covered in dust and blood, his face a hard, grim mask. But in his eyes, she saw the man she loved. He did not speak. He simply finished cutting her free, and then, with an infinite aching gentleness, he lifted her into his arms. He carried her out of the camp of death, away from the bodies and the blood, and started the long walk back through the desert. She leaned her head against his chest, her body limp with exhaustion and relief. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear. "You came for me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the rough fabric of his shirt. He did not slow his pace. He held her tighter, his arms a circle of absolute, unwavering strength around her. He looked down at her, his stormy gray eyes fierce with a love that had been forged in blood and fire. "You're mine," he said. They rode east, toward the rising sun and the distant promise of a capital city built of stone and law. Tucked deep in Eli's saddlebags, wrapped in oilcloth, was the ledger, a thin book filled with a thick, damning record of stolen lives. Mira carried the diary, its fragile pages a testament to the courage of a girl named Ruth. These were not just books, they were weapons, the only ones that could truly end the war that had been waged against them. They were battered, bruised, and bone-weary, their bodies a map of the violence they had endured. But for the first time, they were not running from something. They were riding toward it. The journey was a long, tense pilgrimage. Every distant rider was a potential threat, every canyon a potential ambush. They spoke little, their communication a language of shared glances, of a hand on a shoulder, of the simple, reassuring presence of the other. Eli's vengeance, the cold, hard stone he had carried in his gut for a decade, had been replaced by a different kind of fire, a fierce, protective need to get Mira to safety, to see this through not for the dead, but for the living. They were 2 days from the capital, riding through a landscape of rolling hills that would soon give way to farmland, when the sky began to bleed from blue to a bruised, heavy gray. A storm was coming. The air grew thick and electric, the wind picking up, whipping Mira's hair across her face. Eli scanned the horizon. His eyes narrowed. It was not just the storm that worried him. A feeling, cold and sharp as a knife's edge, prickled at the back of his neck. They were being followed. "Ride faster," he said, his voice low and urgent. They spurred their horses, the animals sensing the tension, their hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. But their pursuers were fresh. They appeared over the crest of a hill behind them. 5 riders, moving with the grim purpose of men who were paid to kill. Marston's last, desperate attempt to bury his sins. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall as the first shot rang out. A bullet whizzed past Eli's ear, a deadly insect in the suddenly charged air. The storm broke then, a furious biblical deluge that turned the world to a gray, roaring chaos. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the trail to a slick, treacherous river of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting apart, and lightning bleached the landscape in brief, ghostly flashes. They raced for a small, defensible cluster of rocks, the bounty hunters closing the distance, their shots wild in the downpour. They slid from their horses, taking cover as bullets sparked off the granite around them. Eli returned fire, his Colt steady in his hand. But it was 5 against 1. The odds were long. They were pinned down, the rain soaking them to the skin, the thunder masking the sound of their enemies' movements. Eli knew they would try to flank them. He pushed Mira deeper into the crevice between 2 large boulders. "Stay here," he commanded, his face a grim mask in the flickering lightning. "Do not move." He crept to the edge of the rocks, trying to catch a glimpse of the men through the deluge. He saw one moving low and fast to his left. He fired, and the man went down. But in that same instant, another attacker burst from behind a rock to his right, a massive, bearded man with a long knife in his hand. He had gotten in too close. Eli turned, firing, but his foot slipped in the slick mud. His shot went wide. The man was on him, his weight crashing into Eli, sending them both sliding down into a muddy hollow. Eli's gun flew from his grasp, lost in the mire. They wrestled in the mud and the rain, a desperate, grunting struggle for life. The man was bigger, stronger. He raised the knife, its blade glinting in a flash of lightning. Eli caught his wrist, straining against the crushing pressure, the point of the blade hovering inches from his throat. His strength was failing. He could feel the man's wrist begin to tremble, not with weakness, but with the effort of driving the blade home. It was then that a new sound cut through the roar of the storm. Not thunder, but the sharp, definitive crack of a pistol. The man above Eli stiffened. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. The pressure on Eli's arm vanished. The man slumped sideways, a dark hole appearing in his temple, and lay still in the mud. Eli looked up, his chest heaving. Mira was standing at the edge of the hollow. The Colt held out in both of her trembling hands, smoke curling from its barrel. Her face was a pale oval in the gloom, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce, triumphant resolve. She had not stayed put. She had taken the gun he had taught her to use, the gun he had dropped, and in the moment when all was about to be lost, she had saved his life. The remaining bounty hunters, seeing 2 of their number fall and their leader vanquished in such a definitive way, lost their nerve. They fired a few more wild shots into the rocks and then faded back into the storm, their greed outweighed by their fear. Eli staggered to his feet, mud-caked and bleeding from a dozen small cuts. He went to Mira, who was still standing frozen, the heavy gun pointing at the ground. He gently took it from her hands. She collapsed against him, her body shaking with the violent aftershocks of what she had done. He held her, his face buried in her wet hair, his heart pounding with a gratitude so profound it left no room for words. The cycle was broken. She was no longer the saved. She was the savior. They arrived in the state capital 2 days later, a city of brick buildings and paved streets that seemed like a world away from the one they knew. They were a sight to behold, their clothes torn and mud-stained, their faces etched with exhaustion, their bodies bruised and aching. They looked like ghosts haunting a world that was too clean, too orderly for the things they had seen. They did not go to the sheriff. Eli knew that the law in a place like this could be as corrupt as any border town saloon owner. They went straight to the governor's office. They were stopped at the door by a young, clean-shaven aide in a starched collar who looked at them with a mixture of pity and disdain. "The governor is a busy man," he said, his tone dismissive. Eli reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the ledger. He placed it on the aide's polished desk. "This is a record of every girl Silas Marston has bought and sold for the last 15 years, he said, his voice low and steady. "This," he added, placing Ruth's diary beside it, "is the story of one of them. You give these to the governor. You tell him that if he is half the man he claims to be, he will burn Marston's empire to the ground." The aide's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. The cold, hard evidence of an industrial-scale operation of human misery was undeniable. His dismissive demeanor evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror. He looked up at them, his face pale. "I will see that he gets these immediately," he stammered. "There will be justice, I promise you, but
These things, they take time. Warrants must be issued, testimonies gathered. It may take some time. Those last words were the ones that finally broke Mira. After all the running, all the fighting, all the death, to be told that justice was a matter of paperwork and patience was an insult too deep to bear. The strength that had held her up through the shootout, through the long ride, finally crumbled. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The cycle, it seemed, would never truly end. The world would just keep on turning, grinding up girls like her while men in clean collars talked about taking their time. Eli put his arm around her, his heart aching at the sound of her despair. He looked at the aide, his gray eyes cold as a winter sky. "We do not have time," he said. He turned Mira away from the desk and led her out of the grand office, back into the light of the street. He held her, right there on the busy boardwalk, letting her cry. When her sobs finally subsided, she looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a vast, weary emptiness. "What now, Eli?" she whispered. "Do we just wait?" He shook his head, a slow, certain movement. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not the haunted avenger, but a man who had finally found his way home. "No," he said, his voice full of a promise that was more sacred than any law. "We are not waiting. We are starting over." They left the city that day, with the last of their money. They bought a small, neglected patch of land north of the new railroad line. It was not much, just 100 acres of rolling hills, a stand of cottonwoods, and a creek that ran clear and cold. It had nothing but potential, and to them, that was everything. They built their home from nothing. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their hands and bodies aching with the clean, honest pain of creation. Eli felled trees and squared them into logs. Mira, her initial clumsiness giving way to a surprising strength, helped him hoist them into place. They built the walls, chinked them with mud and moss, and raised a roof against the sky. It was a small, simple cabin, but it was theirs. Every nail they hammered, every log they set, was an act of defiance against the world that had tried to destroy them. They were not just building a house, they were building a life. The months passed. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The winter rains came, washing the dust from the air and turning the hills a vibrant, living green. And with the spring, the wildflowers bloomed. Mira, who had dreamed of such a thing in a cold, dark cabin, now walked through fields of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush. She planted a small garden, and the sight of the first green shoots pushing through the dark earth filled her with a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. She got chickens, and their cheerful, clucking presence was a constant, happy sound. And she began to laugh again, not the rare, surprising sound it had once been, but easily and often, a sound that was as natural and beautiful as the creek that flowed through their land. One night, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the stars emerge in the twilight sky, Eli took her hand. He opened his palm, and in it lay a small, simple silver ring. It was not perfectly round, and its surface was not perfectly smooth, but it shone with a soft, warm light of its own. "I made it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "From a bullet. One of the ones from the fight in the storm." He had taken a symbol of their violent past, melted it down in the heat of his small forge, and hammered it into a promise for their future. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "Mira," he began, but he did not know the words for a proper proposal. He had never known them. He did not need to. Tears were streaming down Mira's face, but they were tears of a joy so profound, so complete, that it left no room for speech. She said nothing. She simply leaned forward, her hand coming up to cradle his face, and kissed him. It was a kiss that was an answer to every question, a healing for every wound, a promise for all the days to come. It was the kiss of a woman who was free. A month later, a letter arrived.
carried by a boy from the nearest town. It was postmarked from the capital. Eli opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. It was from the governor's aide. Silas Marston had been arrested. The ledgers had held up. His entire operation, from the border towns to the mining camps, was being dismantled. The letter ended with a final, poignant note. In their investigation of the compound, they had found a series of unmarked graves. Near one, carved into the bark of an old cottonwood tree, was a name, Ruth, and beneath it, a list of 3 other names, the girls she had died trying to save. The next day, Eli rode to Santa Rosa. He found the tree and the simple wooden cross that now marked his sister's grave. He stood there for a long time, the wind whispering through the cottonwood leaves, a sound like a long, gentle sigh. He was not filled with the rage or the grief that he had expected. He felt only a quiet, profound peace. He had not saved her, but he had honored her. He knelt and touched the name carved into the cross. "I found someone you'd be proud of," he whispered to the silent earth. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Mira standing beside him, her face full of a quiet, loving understanding. She knelt beside him and placed a single, bright wildflower on the grave. She looked from the name on the cross to the face of the man she loved. "Your brother saved me," she said softly, her voice carrying on the wind, "and I saved him back." Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.